Crowdsourced Tribune presents, in association with Crowdsourced Politics. This is Cypher State.
So, as we said at the top of the show, this is Cypher State, and we are going to be talking about the French elections, which this episode's title is going to be called French Restoration. And you might wonder why. Well, because it looks like France is in somewhat of a new revolutionary mood, and that is why the elections may have turned out the way that they did. Before we get into the meat of the argument, I want to know Tiberius's thoughts about what has happened with this past parliamentary election and whether or not it met his expectations of what was going to go down, or if he was a little bit surprised. Tiberius, please go ahead.
This is gonna be so much fun. So the long and the short that I want to give you guys is that I didn't have a lot of expectations because the French and their politics is exceptionally weird compared to everybody. I forget even talking about what happened. The fact that we saw as much movement as we have is both incredibly interesting, but honestly, I'm going to say quite a bit concerning. So I had no expectations into where everything was going to go in moving forward, because while we had the presidential election earlier in the year, that is only a bit of a litmus test for where people are feeling. And it does give you an idea of like what the mood is. Le Pen was doing incredibly well, even though she lost again. But the fact that we have seen the movements that we have indicates a greater theme, which I will probably talk about coming forward.
Yeah, no, that's 100% fair. I think for me personally here with what happened with the French elections was that the things that I was surprised about was with how much of a loss the Macron party had suffered, but not that they suffered a loss per se. And I say that primarily because that they don't have a majority, and I thought that they were going to eke out a majority from the election. But we'll get into why that is the case. And for this episode, I think it is very important to have some background information about where French politics is now and why it's where it's at. So to just start off with, the French President Macron started his own party in 2016. And that party went through several different names right now. Right now it is called, I had it. God dang it. My notes are gone, of course. So, but it's basically it translates to the Renaissance. And that's why we're calling this episode a little bit of restoration. Part of that is a little tongue in cheek there. But he essentially started his own party as this kind of liberal center left, center right coalition party. He defected from the socialist government. He wasn't ever really a member, but he was very much a technocrat and on more left leaning of the technocratic mold. And so he worked with President Hollande back during his presidency as what amounts to the equivalence of a finance minister. Bringing it forward, everybody knows about what happened with the Yellow Vest protest. But before I talk about the Yellow Vest protest in France, Tiberius, do you have anything you want to add to what I just said, or anything you would like to bring up specifically with the Yellow Vest protest?
What I was going to say would probably be a derail from that, so I'm not going to jump too much on it. When it comes to Yellow Vest protest, there's a bit of a problem with it. Number one, while it was a surge in the protesting, rioting, whatever you want to call it, that we see within the French system, the problem is that there's a running joke that the recreational holiday every Sunday for the French people is to go out and protest. I don't mean to say that as a joke. That's kind of what they do. It's quite amazing that like the French just don't make a lot of sense to me in ways, because they actually have some of the highest political activism of any Western country. When you're talking about people being involved, when you're talking about people actually speaking their voice, whether it's voter voter participation, political unity, or political speaking. I apologize. The long and the short here is that the French are probably and have been the most politically charged democracy that we've had literally since they tried their various iterations of the republics.
Sure.
So the long and the short here is that when people are like, "Oh, the yellow vests are a thing," I'm like, France is normal. Like, I mean, I hate I hate to be that guy, but I mean, this isn't really this really isn't a break. Half of their political demonstration turns riotous by what we would configure. It's not hard to find something torched at the end of the weekend from somebody, and I hate to put it in that regard, but the French take their politics very seriously, and I really just want to get down into the what has actually happened. So go ahead, sir.
Sure. So that's a very good point that Tiberius brings up. And by French standards, the Yellow Vest protest was actually fairly small. So there was 250,000 roughly at the beginning of the protest back in 2018. And that, by the time it ended 3 months after it began, it was down to about 130,000 or so protest, which is roughly about maybe 25% to 35% lower than a normal protest in France. So that's one of the first things that should be mentioned at the top of this, is that while the Yellow Vest protest made eyes pop in the United States and other places around the world, this was, a baby protest by French standards. Now, another thing that should be mentioned about the Yellow Vest protest is that it was a general disdain for the establishment. And it wasn't it's a disdain for institutions per se, but that they distrusted the entrenched political kings and kingmakers that make up the establishment. They also hated the media, but were very often seen on French media television, as well as YouTube, Facebook, etc., going out and always saying, fuck the media, they're always out to get us, but I'm going to talk to you right now. And they particularly liked Russia Today, which is kind of interesting, given that, Russia Today is literally a government-ran media organization. One of the things that Russia Today did while interviewing these protesters was also to promote the idea that the French government was trying to illegally subvert the entire movement and basically coming down and cracking skulls, which basically didn't happen until like way later. Like the amount of arrest went up as the protest went on, but at the first like 2 or 3 protests, there was very little arrest, like 30, 40 across the entire country. So patently false that was the narrative that they had for the for what was going on. Now, this was a populist movement without a central guiding principle as well, besides fuck the man and don't tax us. Now, it was spurred on by a gas tax in hopes of doing something to fight climate change, and was widely supported by the metropolitan and elite class, but not by the rural and working class citizens. Here too, there was some echoes of what caused the rise of Trump. First, those engaged in the protest were not just the bottom of the economic strata, but also the precarious middle class, and middle class among disaffected rural voters and small business owners and the like. Secondly, probably most importantly, is the idea that the city centers have reaped the benefits of modern life at the expense of the exurbs and the rural areas. Not only did they reap those benefits, but they looked at the exurbs and the rural areas with scorn and derision. That was a wide sentiment among the protesters. So these grievances brought both extremes of the political spectrum, both that agreed that they are taxed too much and others not taxed enough, but did not agree at anything else whatsoever. Like the United States, the association with right-wingers was difficult to shake. A nationalist and anti-neoliberal globalism current ran throughout the movement. Now, so there is, to me personally, there is some modicum of truth that the French tax system does favor the rich above others. The VAT tax in France does not exempt any goods or services. It simply has a greatly reduced tax on necessary goods and services, as well as some cultural relevant ones like theater. So this means that any good not in these categories is taxed at 20%, where everything else is taxed either at 10 or 5% therein. At a minimum, 5.5% at a minimum. Now, the income tax in France is on middle-class families making roughly about $53,000 a year USD, and at a rate up to 12%, 9% coming from the Social Security equivalent tax and 3% from others. Low by United States standards and kind of low by global standards for that amount. However, as in the United States, wealthy people that live just off of their capital and are able to live off of, $30,000, $40,000 of actual income versus their loans from investments or what have you are not taxed at all. So this is another issue where we can see kind of the yellow vests echoing some sentiments that are in the United States as well as the rest of the West. Now, in response to these grievances, though, President Macron held a series of debates across the country called the Grand Débat, or Grand Debate. The purpose of these debates was for Macron to try to connect directly with the people and make an impassioned case for his policies, even if they were unpopular. This was Macron's version of Trump going to Twitter, because France does not have a tradition of town halls. Usually what they did was go to power brokers, union leaders, mayors, etc., and have them disseminate information and take back feedback and put it up to the top. So this was Macron coming down and saying, hey, look, this is what I think. I'm going to debate you. I'm going to hear you. I'm going to listen to you. And let's get this going. Let's get some of these fixes. And among some of the proposals from the Grand Debate were to lower the VAT tax, which obviously, reinstate the wealth tax, expand social services, allow people to vote none of the above by handing in a blank ballot if they go to vote, expanding social services to rural areas, and picking representatives by lottery, among other things. A central contradiction in the Grand Debate was a desire for lower taxes but expanded government services, which is something that we see across most democracies. Now, as the protests went on, they got more violent, and because of some of that violence, because of what Macron's debate tour and concessions made by the French government, the numbers started to drop immensely, starting, like I said, about 250,000 and ending around 140,000, which again is very small by French standards. Now, what Macron did to assuage some of these protests was he implemented a supplemental increase to the minimum wage, which is basically government saying, hey, if you make minimum wage, here's an extra money. That was of 100 euros per month, and not taxing overtime, and not adding a proposed tax increase onto small pensions. The French pension system is way more complicated than the United States pension system, but to make a long story short, basically, if the pension was of a lower value, or if there was not as many people in it, the proposed tax increase would exempt those. So he just said, we're not going to do that. I hear you. I see you. I believe you. I agree with you. This is not fair, so we're not going to do it. Now, in a move that was a bit surprising, Macron actually asked French businesses to give end-of-year bonuses and said that those end-of-year bonuses would not be taxed. Which is the reason I say this is interesting is simply because that unlike what happened with Trump's tax cuts, where a tax cut was implemented, businesses as a result, which we all know, let's be real, he went to businesses to be like, hey, this is how you can make people like these things and give them bonuses as a result. He said, hey, give them bonuses and we won't tax it. And so the French public didn't actually see that as a good thing. They thought it was scraps from the table. So that was the Yellow Vest protest from a general perspective there. Tiberius, what are your thoughts about some of these things? Am I right that there are echoes of American politics in this or anything like that?
I have so much to add to this. So let me give you a quick rundown. Number one is that what we're seeing in the United States is actually kind of what we're seeing in the Western world. It's just like in the Western world, throughout most of Europe in particular is that it's a little different because they're far more urbanized than we are. The United States actually has a really good balance between like the people who are rural slash suburban and people who are suburban slash urban. Western Europe doesn't really have that, and so if you're a ruralite in most of Europe at this point, unless you're in Poland, Eastern Europe, I'm so sorry about that.
Oh, what
Every
happened?
time. Every time the dogs just want to
Ah.
say hello to the stream, particularly about 9 o'clock, and I don't know why. But anyway, um, anyway, getting back to what I was saying, the United States, um, what we're seeing here is very akin, but it's balanced. Out in Western Europe, in particular, urban density is so much higher that literally the urban courts just absolutely and overwhelmingly outvote anybody and everybody who could coalition against them. There really isn't the suburbs in Europe except for a few places. And the rural populations, while they exist, they are just dramatically drowned out because Europe isn't that big. Remind you that France is just a little smaller than Texas, and while Texas is big, there's 11 Texases within within the lower 48. So yeah, a lot of room here. Breaking this all down is that those people feel that they're very upset because they have no recourse. The system isn't for them, and I would say that they're largely right. Part two. Um, French history is weird because they have every option. They have plenty of ports, they can do trade, they can have a navy, they have land borders, so they can have a proficient army, and they could actually be like a coalesced entity. Every option that a political power has kind of had, France has had, and yet they failed at everything compared to their neighbors. And I've actually would say that the French have a terrible habit of not putting enough eggs in a basket versus everybody else having to. So when you went into basically a massive geopolitical conflict with the British, eventually they lost because the French had a land border that they had to deal with the Germans on. And then, of course, later is that while the French would try to build a navy continuously, they would fail to interact with the Germans, and the Germans became the most powerful land force within all of Europe. I say this because I feel like the French know their history, and they know that they need to put eggs in a certain basket now because the world is flipping on its head. France is going to be the only country that matters in Western Europe in 15 years. And I know that's a big claim, but the demographic data, which we just had in our last conversation a little bit, shows that France is the only one that has a long-term viability. So what does France do when it's the most powerful country in Europe? And that's this conversation for those who understand it. And that's where I get to the part three. This election is scarily looking like the 1930 election within Germany. Yes, you had this great yes, you have this great political coalition that Macron built, and he built this because the equivalent for the French, the Republicans and the Democrat, basically just blew apart at the same time. So there was a power vacuum, and Macron capitalized on it, made one of the biggest French coalitions that I understand since De Gaulle. That has not proven effective to the French people, and the problem is that Macron is every bit of kind of what I am, more of a Republican centrist candidate that believes in like liberal principles. But you know what? Let's keep a free market where we possibly can. And he's losing because he's got the same problem that every other Western nation has. They've got the system isn't working for the people who need it to work for them, and he's bleeding because of it. And so we have seen not just the radical right, whether you call them Le Pen radical right, whatever. We're seeing the right and the left consolidate around as the antithesis of this. And the reason why I say it's so scary is that it does remind me of that 1930 election, to where, hey, things are getting worse in Germany, and you went from these two parties, which really didn't matter at all, to being the number 2 and 3 respective parties within the German chancellorship. And that, of course, was the NSDAP, aka the Nazis, and the KPD, aka the communists. France is kind of there. Like, if you break this all down, everyone's coalitioning, so it's weird because Macron's coalition's like 4 different parties, actually. Yep. But when it comes down to it, is that when you look at the 3 coalitions that are now formed out of this, the center is getting eaten away at, and the radical extremes, if you will, are uh, slowly expanding out into eking out their political foothold. And I'm sorry, Le Pen was the last presidential contender. She was this presidential contender against Macron. And if she had done literally 5 points better, she would be the president of France. It was like, it's not that far. So to me, we're seeing that France is politically, I'm not gonna say unstable, but France is going through a political transition and everyone knows it. And the French people have to decide what direction they want to go. That's actually the easy part for the French, because once they decide, they have an election, but then they have to drag the other basically half of the country kicking and screaming. Sounds a little bit closer to home, doesn't it?
For sure.
That's kind of the issue that France has, and it always has. This is why this is the country who did so well in World War One to helping like repel the Germans to literally falling apart in 6 weeks. Their political system wasn't behind their military, and we're kind of seeing that now, where the political system is trying to keep itself together. And so, whether the French are talking economically, militarily, whatever, there's a reason why we don't have the French helping out with Ukraine. They're not there. They can't be there. So I'm sorry that I kind of went around about to get where I wanted to make my point, but I had to paint the picture. And the picture is that France is in a really weird state.
Yeah, no, that's completely fair. And some of the things that I want to pick up on that actually goes towards the next protest that the French experienced right before the presidential election, which was with the union protest. And so the union protest was like sparked by and then we mentioned this previously, but sparked by what amounts to a reform of their social security system. And the primary reform that Macron wanted to do was increase the retirement age by 2 years. Now, people would think, oh, 2 years, that's a lot of time, right? But within the French system, people typically retire at age 60. That's like the average retirement age. It's got a complicated system. People are able to retire sooner if they work in more grueling jobs, which I actually agree with, because if you're doing backbreaking labor, you're not going to enjoy your retirement years if you have to work into your 60s, right? So that's something I actually agree with. But from going from 60 to 62, it doesn't seem like that much of a leap. But this sparked off a huge labor union protest. And at first, the more moderate, largest private sector union, which was called, let's see. So Democratic Confederation of Labor, they weren't actually going to be supporting this because they had assurances from President Macron that the actual retirement age would not raise with his scheme, because the scheme that he had in was that instead of it being a system where your later years basically award you more money as you get closer to retirement, every year you worked would give you points, and those points would make up the difference for some jobs, and other jobs would fall a little bit. But the Prime Minister, Edward Philippe, said that the retirement age should be raised by 2 years, outright said it, and that caused the Democratic Confederation of Labor to join those protests. And similar to the Yellow Vest protest, while it started with a single issue, the raising of the retirement age, it became a conglomeration of other grievances. Among those include COVID-related inflation, and which at the time was only at 2.8%, which is a little ironic, but it caused them to go out and protest to ask for increased wages to meet that increase in prices. They also demanded doctors get more staff and be given better working hours and conditions to meet with the COVID issue, as well as outright reduction in energy prices, both in terms of petrol and electricity, and an increase to the minimum wage. So all this kind of went into the French presidential election, which is important to bring up because the French presidential election, which happened in April, is kind of a precursor to what we're seeing now. And we should get into that a little bit. But Tiberius, do you have anything you want to add to what I just said?
I gotta show my political ass a little bit here on this one, and my particular bias. One of the things that I didn't mention, but I do want to point out, is that France and economics are a little weird. And I'm going to openly say that I don't like the way that they operate, and I think the French are kind of figuring out and having a big conversation about that too. France has been throughout its history one of the leading nations as far as GDP, government spending to GDP ratio.
Yes.
This is a country that, like, you call it a social democracy. They have spearheaded this on every front. They make the Swedes look like a joke more often than not. And I'm going to say it. I think this has always been something that's kind of hampered them more than it's helped. I'm always been one of those guys that I don't think social spending helps nearly as a lot of people think it does. And I think that there's a lot of people who consistently keep going out and saying it's like, look, we got the Germans next to us, we got the British, just off the coast, and they're always doing better than us. So what do we need to do to emulate the things that they're doing to do better? I could be wrong in this one because I don't speak French. My French is terrible. But what I get the general sense is that the French know that they've been uncompetitive and they need to figure out how to do it. And I've really been kind of a cheerleader for Macron because he's literally kind of embodied exactly what I wanted them to see. Very strong republicanism, very strong, I'm going to say, like, free market money measure, but very much, hey, let's pull it back. Let's interact with a market in a far more controlled way. We need to stop. Doing all the social spending. And to kind of put this on, put the icing on the cake here. 60 years for the retirement age is freaking ridiculous for a developed nation. Almost every other developed nation outside of like a few Mediterranean nations are 65 going towards 68. You can talk about the United States here, or Germany, or a few others. You're talking about having a retirement age is the same as Egypt, a place that has less than $10,000 a day year per capita. France, get it together.
No, I think that's fair. And I am of the opinion that people should be able to retire earlier than later. So I wouldn't want to see the United States raise its retirement age to 67 to 68 years old, because I know that the people that's going to mess up the most are the working poor. People that have to be standing on their feet all day, every day, and breaking their backs, farmers, all these people, like, people need to be able to retire. They just need to be able to retire. And if you don't have a system set up where you can have people retire and actually somewhat enjoy it, then they're just working stiffs their entire life, and they don't see the benefits of a modern economy bringing it to them, right? They're going to see that they are working longer hours than their grandparents, than their parents, that they're getting a little less out of the system than their forebears were, so to speak. And so I'm with people that are like, no, don't raise the retirement age. At the same time, 62 doesn't sound that bad to me, especially when the average age is in France, I believe it's 76, 78 is the average age of death, mortality age. I could be wrong about those exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure those are close to accurate. So that's one primary thing there. So all these things came to a head in the French presidential election. And with the French presidential election, as Tiberius had said earlier, there was a pull away from the center towards the more extremes. And the two parties that pulled away from the two parties that ended up gaining the most from those pulls away from the center were Le Pen's National Rally Party and the Democratic Socialist Party, La France Insoumise. I think I pronounced that right, which is a Democratic Socialist Party. And the person that led that party for the presidential election is Mélenchon. And so we had this weird situation of the way the French do their presidential election system is that what they do is they have a first round vote. So everybody goes through and votes who they would like to see. And then from there, they have a second round runoff, an actual campaign runoff for a second round between the top two contenders. And the top two contenders from that was Macron and Le Pen. Le Pen is part of this. Now, Tiberius might disagree with me for a little bit here, but they are a nationalist party, and they have a history of outright xenophobia and racism in their party. Person that founded the party basically was a Holocaust denialist, and his daughter is now running the party, but she's a little more polished, if we could say, give some a little bit of charitability there. But she was able to benefit from an even more extreme candidate that basically said that every single Muslim within France should be expelled. And not only that, we shouldn't do anything. We, the French, shouldn't do anything to help Ukraine. We should actually pay Poland off to take those refugees and resettle them into Poland. Keep them away from us. We understand that they need a place to go because war sucks, but it's not our problem. We'll pay somebody else off so they don't come here. And that didn't sit well with the French population. And because of his extremism, though, she was able to pick up pretty much 80% of his vote, and then a little bit from other people that supported her as well. So that's why she was able to come up on second. I didn't get as much research into the Democratic Socialist Mélenchon, but that is how we saw the party, the first round of voting shake up. And in order to beat back the resurgence of the right with Le Pen, Macron made an appeal to leftists with promises of doing things to reform and benefit the average working person, as well as appealing to their shared values. And that won him the election. He was able to win. He had, 56% of the vote or so, Tiberius? 52, 53?
I can't remember off the top, but like he got enough for an easy threshold, and it was actually quite wider than a few people thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
I actually thought that in that election, Le Pen and Macron were going to get really close. And when it came to that election, I do want to hit this thing. What we see with the radical right and the radical left in France was very much what we see here in the United States, in the regards that the radical right is way better at coalescing behind one person.
Yeah.
And Le Pen is, if you will, Le Pen is, and even her enemies regard her as this. You called it polished, but she's done a lot of work in getting Frontier National to kind of wipe away the original founding views that it had, if you will. I'm not going to say whether she's openly racist or not. I don't really know. And quite honestly, I don't really care. What it is, absolutely, is a French nationalist party. And it's very interesting to see, like, the sadist in me kind of wants to see this party win just to see what it actually would do.
Ew.
Because I don't know. I don't know. Because I want to know if this is literally just another run-of-the-mill, like, hard right party, or if it's just like, hey, look, we don't like the EU. We think it's a disaster. Let the Ukrainians rot. There's a big sentiment with that in the EU. We had Brexit, right? So for me, I'm kind of wondering what level of this is just Boris Johnson, bad hair day, like we don't like this kind of deal, versus like, oh, hey, we get to see the French Nazis this time. Like, the sadist in me wants to know. But on the other side of that is that when it came to the far left candidate, they do what they always do. They couldn't get behind anybody, and so they split their votes, as they usually do. Good job.
You're not pure enough for me, bucko. But yeah, that's
I don't know where the left, like the left was never the Puritan type, but I don't know where they took like anti-Puritanism that the left used to have in most of the developed world, and all of a sudden in the last like 10 to 15 years they flipped it on its head, and now they're super Puritans. They make the right actually look a little bit tame. It's just like, well, I'm not voting for you because there's that one thing that you do that I don't agree with you on. And I'm like, the right would never do this.
Yeah, I think this is something that the left has always had an issue with. It's just that the liberal base of the lib-left coalition was bigger back in, we'll say, the 60s. You had the super radicals, don't get me wrong, the super radicals in the 60s went around and bombed places, right? That's what they were doing at that time. But that was still a minority. right? A really tiny minority of the lib-left coalition. And because of, and this is one of the primary reasons why we're seeing what's going on in France happening, in my opinion, one of the primary reasons that you're seeing this resurgence is the failure of neoliberalism to actually assuage people's fears and also directly improve the material conditions of every citizen everywhere, pretty much, for the most part. There's going to be different variations of this in every single country. You have less of this problem in Germany, at least for now, when it comes to economic conditions. But you see a huge issue with Germany's ascendance of the far right around immigration issues, and that is spurred on by the existence of the EU to a degree. But we have that issue in the United States, we have that issue in the UK, and we have that issue now coming to the full front in France, because Macron, if nothing else, is this center-right with social liberal proclivities, neoliberal technocrat that is trying to guide France to a new kind of beginning, and it's just not really working out for him as much as he would want. One of the primary things that he got criticized for is that he was seen as this aloof, out of touch figure. And that's why he did the Grand Débat in the first place, is because he wanted to go and connect with people and show them, like, no, I'm actually listening to you. Like, you're making me change my mind here. It's just, I don't know. It's whatever. Right. And that's what you're kind of seeing in that kind of regard. And Le Pen had a similar issue. People thought that she was very gruff. They thought that she was super rough around the edges, and I don't mean that like not polished, but I mean like she came off as a little overbearing, a little like scoffish, that a lot of women get criticized for if they just have an opinion in general to the large part. But that laugh that everybody, like, it kind of not everybody, but a lot of people cringe at when they hear it from like Elizabeth Warren, like like that scoff, like no one likes that, right? No one actually likes that. They get reminded of like being wagged their finger at by like a teacher or something. I don't fucking know, right? But it seems to be a thing, right? It seems to be a thing. And she went through polishing school essentially and toned that down a bit. Started leaning into the fact that she's actually a single mother raising a kid by herself, connecting with people on that very personal level, despite the fact that she is more than likely racist and you know, if not racist, I believe she's racist, but if not racist, at least an extreme nationalist that I would not want to see run a government, so to speak.
Okay, yeah, like I gotta break that all down. I had just an immense amount of hope for Macron. I really did, because he actually does embody a lot of the values that I want to see governments go forward with, but they're losing touch. And then I don't. Let me kind of rework this and rephrase this. The problem with most governments in the West is that they do have a disconnect between the elites and the populace does not believe that the elites are working for them at all. I get that, and there's definitely a level where it's kind of true. The other side of that is that the people who are in the quote unquote elite largely more or less have like some of the right ideologies, but they're not able to politically move the needle. I'm just going to put it in this regard. I don't think the problem here is that the ideology is bad. I actually don't. I think the people who embody it are the problem. They're not their forebears. They're boomers. Just gonna say it. They're damn boomers. They are not the people who raised them. They are not the great generation. They're not the people who fought the world wars. They're not the people who had to deal with massive civil rights issues. These are the people who grew up when those fights were over. What is their fight? Oh, hey, isn't this all great? The Soviet Union's gone. We've got more growth than we've ever seen. Let's just, figure out how to write more debt on the credit card. Just pass it off the kids. We're good. I think that's good. As silly as this sounds, I do feel that is the general takeaway from most of the leaders throughout Europe and throughout North America, is that they just don't know how to govern. And that will solve itself in time because you will have new people who will have to step in those shoes. It's up to the people to kind of realize that if they're over 55, they grew up in a world that they don't understand anymore. And it's time just to kind of ship
That's
them
fair.
out. I hate to be like that because it's just blatantly freaking ageist, but there's a level where I've said it and I'm just getting to the point where I'm absolutely very just conglomerately upset with the older folks. Is that when I talk to them, when I engage with them, is they're not willing to change, they're not willing to partner up, and more particularly is that they don't think they've done anything wrong. And I'm kind of tired of hearing about it. I really am.
We left you kids everything, and it's your fault that we're in this shit. Like, that's
Yeah.
a lot of the mentality. Like, it really is.
It is, and I'm like, yeah. Who set the record for divorce rates? Who set the record for for personal, private, corporate debt across the board? You talk about the actual like social cues that most people agree on that is showing that we have a bad society or decaying society. All happening during the boomers' reign. All happening during the boomers' reign. So anyway, I don't want to turn this episode into "Screw the Boomers" French edition, but I I do want to kind of throw that out there. Is that like Macron actually was probably one of the closest people to actually try to maybe pull this off, but Macron's got the Justin Trudeau problem. He's great at being personable and talking to people and engaging people, but he can't get stuff done.
Yeah.
It's Obama all over again. And this is the leaders that we keep seeing out of this this particular cadre. You're going to need somebody who's willing to do some reformations. Think people who are going to be like, "All right, we believe in this core ideology, but we're going to change this thing up. So instead of throwing so much money at this thing, I'll put it this way. Instead of throwing so much at wind and solar, maybe we're going to try nuclear, or maybe we're going to try this." That is the people you need to be looking for. It's people that's like, hey, look, I like where we've gotten to. We are a society that is still incredibly wealthy, a society that still believes in civil rights and is trying to do its damnedest to push that forward. Excusing Roe v. Wade. But
yeah, that's a whole other ball of wax.
Anyway, the long and the short here is I think there's plenty of room for people to move forward on, and going into the arms of the radical right or the radical left just scares me, and it looks like that's the French are wanting to do the same thing that everybody else is doing. Stop.
Yeah.
Come back to sanity.
I mean, and that was the appeal that Macron had made, right? He was like, hey, you don't want to be with the Nazis, which is what he painted Le Pen as, right? Because all her supporters are crazy. Like, right, come to me, we'll vote, we'll have a good time, we'll fix some stuff, be Gucci. And then in the last 5 months, like May, June, 4 months, nothing has changed fast enough, and things have gotten worse due to the global economic conditions that we all find ourselves in. Just-in-time supply dying, the war in Ukraine causing a food shortage, which is driving up food prices. The one of the things that Le Pen tried to maneuver around was, saying let's sanction Russia because what they're doing is bad, but let's not do it on gas and natural gas and oil because that's going to hurt us, and it's just not worth. Like they're like, it's just not worth the cost, man. Like, democracy is good and all, but that's their problem. That's not an us problem. So she tried to navigate that and win her some votes, and that's probably why she did probably as well as she did in some regards. And since everything's gotten worse, the parliamentary elections didn't address any of those the government prior to the parliamentary elections didn't address any of those problems, or at least not quick enough. And unlike the way that he took on Le Pen with a united front against the Nazis and the racist, he tried to do a Republican front against the socialist. And a lot of the ads, and you can go online and look these up, a lot of the ads that were targeting like young voters and stuff like that to try to win them over was like, if you vote for the socialists, their policies are going to make it so you can't enjoy your trip to Morocco. Like literally an ad that came out. You're not going to be able to join your trip to Morocco because they want out of the EU or whatever the fuck it was, and they're going to make it more expensive. And so you're just not going to be able to go. How is that going to attract anybody that isn't already rich and on your side to vote for you? It's just not. People that can't afford a Moroccan trip are going to look at that and be like, you're fucking stupid. How dare you say this while I'm struggling with gas prices and my energy bill is going up? We just had massive protest 5-6 months ago to address these things, and you're pulling this shit. Well, then fuck it, right? I'm not going to vote for you. So they voted for the socialist. And then the other end, because they every election in France is either is some sort of runoff. I think it's instant runoff for parliamentary elections. They didn't vote second round. People that voted for Macron that Macron didn't have a seat, didn't win, didn't make it to the next round, left it blank. And so his Republican front basically turned him, his first run as president turned him off to the nationalist. Parliamentary thing turned him off to the socialist. They didn't just vote. And so when they didn't make it in, a lot of people were just like, hey, they got more support over there over at National Rally. I'm going to join them, and at least they're trying to fix something. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we saw. You're giggling, man. Like, break in.
I hate the times we live in. Whoever said, may you live in interesting times was an asshole. I'm just saying. Just saying it. Look, I'll put it this way. The part of me that is an administrator, the part of me that likes them to see everything run kind of nice and that people need to understand the role and like how things work, is literally looking at the world right now, whether it be French politics or American politics or just economic structures, and is having a internal meltdown. Okay, I'm not doing well. I'm not handling this. I'm not coping. The other side of this, where I'm just like, all right, I'll call it this way. The other part of me that's the spectator that just kind of likes to be like, all right, humanity, you have options. You can do things. What option will you choose? The part that just kind of likes to sit back and watch this show is actually thoroughly enjoying and loving this, because like I love on a level to see what happens when the rubber meets the road. I like to see when people are like, oh, I believe in this value, and then they actually have to, sacrifice for something for it. This decade is going to be incredibly illuminating to what people actually give a crap about. And I'm quite interested to see what, particularly this year, and we'll be hitting this on the next episode, spoiler alert. Ethiopia is where we're going to be revisiting next. And when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, when it comes to South Asia as a whole, you're talking about famine conditions this year. Like, the UN is screaming about this. So, I'm quite interested. What do people value whenever they can't get food? And the probability of it is that they care about food. And very little else. And I want to see what happens towards the end of this year and going into next year with the Europeans, because there is a very, very real possibility that the Europeans, particularly most of Europe, can't turn their heat or their lights on at the end of the year. Yeah. Who cares about what? Does Europe literally rip itself apart literally next year because Eastern Europe can't turn the lights on and Western Europe doesn't give a crap? That's a very real possibility. So I'm going to leave that off as kind of my final note, because I don't really have much to add beyond this point, is that France has choices. France has made a choice in this year that they're going to stick with Macron. They're going to try to stick with this Renaissance coalition, but it doesn't have a supermajority anymore. Yeah. And they're going to have to make some deals with some radicals to push anything through, which they probably will. I don't know who they're going to side with. That's a choice. What kind of policies are they going to pursue? That's a choice. France has choices. You can either sit back, relax, and enjoy the show, or you can panic for France. I'm going to do both. I'm just going to be blatant honest. Part of me is going to be doing both. But I guarantee you we're going to have some wonderful content here on Cypher State for you for the better part of the next year as we see people make these choices and what the fallout is from them.
Yeah, no, that's 100% true. we're going to be covering all this. We're going to try to cover stories that other people aren't covering, as well as we can, being the neophytes that we are. Very intelligent neophytes, but still neophytes. One of the things I wanted to bring up, though, was, if I can get this to be proper here, is the actual election results. And this is from the BBC. This is the breakdown. And what we're seeing here is that, as we said, the Ensemble coalition did not win a outright majority. They're about, I think, 10% seats short or so. So they're going to have to go into a coalition government or coalition parliament to get anything accomplished. Because they still have a prime minister, and they have this like dual presidency, prime minister, parliament system. And so that's one thing. The second thing here is that the National Rally Party got record gains, outright record gains when it came to these things. But it wasn't, it's like going from 5% to 15%. So like a huge gain, but still a tiny, a minority party here, right? So the National Rallies is dark blue. They got less than the Socialist Party, the NUPES coalition, right? And what we're seeing here, though, is, like we said earlier, a pull from the middle. But that pull from the middle appears, at least for now, to favor more democratic socialist policies than right-wing national parties. Appears to, because the pull, while they gained a lot of seats, they didn't gain enough seats to overcome the natural base that the Socialist Democrats had. So that makes me think personally here that, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen here. Sorry, that's here. Makes me think personally that what we're actually going to see coming out of this is that there will be some work from Macron with the socialist and maybe one of the other minor parties, the other parties that didn't make much gains, maybe even former allies, former parties that he was in, to get things done. And that could actually save him in the future. But we'll see. Tiberius, thoughts?
It would be in the historical pattern of France to be slightly left. I kind of talked about that earlier regarding their economics, and just kind of reiterating what I said there in a different way. Politically, if you kind of put the litmus test on what all the West kind of looks at, the French have largely been some of the most left-wing people as a nation in the West forever. This is the people who had the French Revolution. These are the people who've now had 5 republics. Don't get me wrong, like, they've had issues, but when it comes down to their political leanings, is that the fact that the far right is doing it, whether you consider Le Pen far right, I guess is still a question. But if you do, the fact that the far right is doing this well in France is actually kind of surprising. Yeah. Because it's usually the far right isn't in the conversation. You usually have Republicans and market liberals, when I say market liberals, like libertarians, coalitioning with like social democrats to keep like the radical left in check. That's usually what happens within France. Macron's trying to coalition with Republicans and social democrats against everybody else, and at first it was working, but I think it was more of a vacuum kind of thing. Now you're seeing everyone in France politically reassert themselves, and we're probably going to see the ugly horrors of what we see in French parliament, or basically any parliamentary system out there. This is actually why I prefer 2 parties, is that you cut a lot of this crap out, and you have to make some really very direct choices in the primary system before you go to the general. This is where parliamentary democracy kind of goes to hell. Is that everybody gets a voice, no matter if they are this guy with 5% of the vote over here who's radical left or radical right. They're treated as a fully legitimate party. And so everyone gets to debate and talk, and it doesn't force them into coalitions that you kind of just need to have. So yeah, fun times had all around.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm curious from your perspective here, because if it's not clear to anybody listening to this, watching this right now, we differ vastly on a lot of issues when it comes to, I wouldn't say vastly, we got some overlap, but you're
saying
is on the right, I'm on the left of the political spectrum, more or less. We're both in kind of the more liberal mode of those positions, so we're not extremes, but we have our disagreements. But one of the things I want to know from Tiberius' perspective is how much of this is a rejection of globalist capitalism versus a rejection of globalist cultural values, in your estimation?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I'll put it this way. I think when it comes to the culture, it's down to I'll say it's both. When it comes down to it, it's down to politics.
Sure.
I think the right is far more concerned about the culture anywhere. If you're talking about France, Britain, what have you, they're worried about the economic stuff. I'm not going to act like they don't. This is why the Republican Party is almost the antithesis of what it was 10 years ago.
Right.
What it definitely looks like to me is that the right cares far more about the cultural issues, and the left still cares about the economic issues, but maybe they may flipping into culture too. But they're like, if anything, they are like the invigoration of those values. Most of the radical left isn't the tankies. They're actually just like in borders, supernation, pan-Europeanism, that kind of thing. That's kind of what I'm getting out of, particularly like the European left. And so for me, there's definitely a cultural whiplash, but that's from the right. The economic whiplash is probably from the left, but it's not. It's weird because I think it's incoherent. But that's always been my big gripe with most lefties of some sort, is that I always thought they were like economically incoherent most of the time. So that's a political bias view, I guess. But it's weird because the right's kind of doing both. If you're kind of breaking down to it, whether it be the Republican Party, Frontier National, is that when it comes down to it, they're both economic and cultural populists. They want to economically detach in forms of like seeing France detach from the European Union, but they also want to culturally detach in that they say France has a rich and vibrant history, which they really, really do. That France should be proud to be French people and not Europeans. And I could totally say that for the Germans or the Brits, but not the French. So yeah, like it's weird. There's a lot of echoes out there, but for me, I think it is just the right saying, we don't like the values, we don't like the economics, we're going to try something different. The left is trying to figure out where to go, and I don't think any of them know exactly which direction to take it. And I'll have to end with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think from my perspective, and I've said this on other programs before, I think that I think it's a little bit of both. I think, largely speaking, the left tend to be more economically dominant in their positions, but I do think that the reason that is the case is because, culturally speaking, worldview speaking, the left has certain values and the right has certain values. If we want to basically broad brush, reduce the people down to their purest form, to create these giant avatars to represent millions of people for the simplicity of argument. And I really do think it boils down to culture. I think it's not the economy stupid. I think it's the culture stupid. I agree with Breitbart. I believe Breitbart was right when he says politics is downstream from culture. And I think what we're seeing is that shakeup of it globally. It was a global phenomenon. The New Deal coalition was a thing that existed across the globe due to the world wars and whatever, the Gilded Age, the Rockefellers and the like, everybody, like the conglomerates in Japan, the super companies that existed in France and Germany. I don't remember their particular names for them, but they existed. And there was a rejection of that from everybody. And because it was everybody versus, the rich, essentially, they created this coalition. And now that coalition is breaking up because people are going back to their natural worldviews because a lot of those issues were, for a time, fixed. And now we're seeing those issues come back, especially since the 1980s with the fall of the Cold War. So that's where I'm at with that. And I think we're seeing it as a rejection on both the left and the right of neoliberal globalist capitalism. But the incoherent policy that Tiberius is talking about or has talked about is an issue of the cultural differences that exist, that had exist in those coalitions now being thrown to the wayside and becoming a more, for lack of a better term, metropolitan class of people that are like diversity is good, and people should be able to go where they want, natural human rights, etc., etc. And the right wing going towards no nation state. It's your nation's your home. If they come into your home, then they're coming to your nation without being invited. It's basically an invasion, and we got to stop that. Like I think these are worldview issues that are coming to a head, and that's going to be the great question across the globe for the next 10 to 20 years.
I'm gonna leave this as a tidbit for our next episode because I've got a feeling that a lot of these issues are gonna get papered over in the coming years. I alluded to this in this episode. 20 or so nations are probably expected to be in famine conditions coming the end of the year, right? I think that's going to end up becoming the dominant question because you are talking about some of the most quote-unquote overpopulated areas of the world. Indonesia, South Asia, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa. No longer being able to access fertilizer and certain parts of the food distribution system. In that world, you're talking about massive migrant crises. You are talking about the biggest refugee flows in human history by a factor of 10. We might see 90% of all of these issues melt over the next 5 years. Because no matter what continent you're on, there is somebody who is probably going to be affected by this to one degree or another. And what does that look like 2 years from now when the food supply was shrunk by 30% globally and you've now got 1 million Guatemalans on the US-Mexico border? We just talked about this in the last episode, where we were talking with Cypher State, where United States immigration still going up, or legal immigration still going up because more people keep showing up. What happens if that increases by a factor of 2 in a year?
Yeah,
which it largely is. That is the concern for most of the wealthy nations right now. Culture issues, economic issues. You're going to have to start looking at the third world as either a potential partner that you need to figure out how to work with, or a potential threat that is going to drown you in a human wave. That's probably where we're going.
I think those are going to end up cleaving on cultural mindsets.
It'll supercharge it, if anything, but it's going to get down to the brass tacks for people. And it's been one of those issues that I think the Europeans particularly have had, whether they want to embrace their national identities or like a pan-European identity, is that the issues coming down is who are people, what are we, and who can we be? And I think everything's going to wrap up this. I think it wraps up this decade to where people are going to force that conversation and they are going to make a decision. And I'm scared.
Yeah,
I'm scared. I'm not worried about for the United States. I think we've got the best geography that's going to keep us insulated from a lot of this.
Thank you, Jesus, for the 2 oceans that separate us from the rest of mankind.
Yeah, pretty much. If you're looking at Eurasia, it's going to go on fire. We're already seeing what happens with the wars of disorders with the Russia-Ukrainian war. What happens if China says Taiwan next year, or this year? Actually, what happens if India and China go after it because of water? Or, well, I was going to say Ethiopia going after it, but we'll talk about that next episode.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about the next episode.
But there is some real conflicts coming about. Egypt not being able to get food is going to be a huge one. Oh my God, it's horrible. So all I'll say is I'm going to wrap this up on my end is my name is Tiberius D. If you want to talk about the end of the world is just the beginning, then definitely come over and check my stuff out on YouTube and Twitch. I've been recording a lot of content as of late, trying to give people the understanding of where my worldview is, but also the coming disasters that are coming. And as much as you have been dealing with inflation, as much as you've been dealing with political uncertainty, I have bad news for you. It's going to get so much worse. But there's some good news. I'm going to be there to walk you through it. I'm going to be there to explain, hey, this is what's coming, at least the possibilities of which. And so you can be at least a little bit prepared for it. Hey, how much is this going to cost? How much is this going to affect me before something kicks in or what has you? And if you're interested in any of that, Tiberius D, Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, I'm on all the things. So you can either come ask me questions or check out my content through that. It is always a massive pleasure to be a guest here on Cypher State. I love our good friend Cypher over here because he comes on my show, the Mask Off Podcast, very consistently. And we always appreciate when we do. When he does, he actually took a 1v4 on this last weekend when it came to Roe v. Wade, and that was a hell of an episode. I can't wait for that one to be in the YouTube docket. And of course, it's uploaded. Just got to wait about a week, and then it'll drop. Anyway, without further ado, thank you once again for having me, sir.
Thank you, Tiberius, for coming on. And yes, everybody's going to check out that episode because I will be ripping it and putting it on my channel because I think I did very well. So we're definitely going to get that on over on ours. But everybody, that is the end of Cypher State. Thank you all so much for joining us for Cypher State. And if you joined us for the previous episode that we had tonight, thank you for that as well. We'll be slicing these episodes into 2 particular episodes and hopefully get those on podcast streaming services to get it a little more polish and to also reach a wider audience. We know what you liked, you heard, because you stayed with us to the end. So go ahead and smash that like button for the algorithms. It really does help us out. And if you or someone you know should be on this show, or you want to talk about something, or what have you, go ahead and reach out to me at Crowdsourced Poll on Twitter, where I like to post memes and other musings as I feel like it. And also, please join the Discord. We're going to be setting up a lot of interesting things on the Discord here in the next year, so be sure to see that. And as we say at Crowdsourced Politics, keep your head up through the political storm.